Imagine waking up one morning to discover that an entire city, a thriving, bustling Roman city of 20,000 people, had simply vanished overnight. Not conquered, not abandoned, not slowly forgotten, just gone. Buried so completely that the world would not find it again for nearly 1,700 years. This is not a legend. This is not a myth. This happened. And the story of how it happened and how it was found is one of the most extraordinary chapters in all of human history. The year was 79 AD. The Bay of Naples stretched out in shimmering blue beneath the Italian sun, and along its northern shore sat one of the most fashionable addresses in the entire Roman Empire. Pompeii was not just a city, it was a statement. Wealthy Romans built their vacation villas here, merchants grew rich trading wine and olive oil across the Mediterranean, gladiators trained in its arenas, bakers pulled fresh loaves from stone ovens before sunrise, children ran through narrow cobblestone streets while their parents stopped at fountains to fill clay jugs with cold, clean water. The city had a population that modern estimates place between 11,000 and 20,000 people, though the wider region likely pushed that number higher. It had theaters, bathhouses, temples, and one of the most sophisticated urban water systems the ancient world had ever seen. By every measure, Pompeii was alive. And right behind it, close enough to see from any rooftop in the city, stood a mountain, Mount Vesuvius. Rising nearly 4,000 feet above sea level, it dominated the skyline the way any landmark does, so familiar that people eventually stopped really seeing it. The Romans knew it was a mountain. They even knew in some vague, half-forgotten way that it had something volcanic about its past. The philosopher Strabo, writing roughly a century before the eruption, noted that the summit looked as though it had once been on fire. There were fertile soils along its slopes, the kind of rich, dark earth that only forms when volcanic ash has had centuries to break down. Farmers planted vineyards there. The grapes were extraordinary. If the mountain was trying to tell people something, they had decided long ago that it was worth ignoring. But Vesuvius was not dormant. It was merely waiting. In the years leading up to 79 AD, the region experienced a series of warning signs that, in retrospect, read almost like a countdown. A major earthquake in 62 AD caused significant damage across Pompeii and the nearby city of Herculaneum. Buildings cracked, some collapsed entirely. The damage was serious enough that 17 years later, repairs were still visibly underway in parts of the city. Wells and springs across the region began behaving strangely, some drying up, others changing temperature, others suddenly tasting of sulfur. In the weeks before August 79, animals in the area became agitated. Locals reported tremors in the ground. None of these things individually would have meant much to a Roman in the first century. There was no science of volcanology. There was no evacuation protocol. There was no word in Latin for volcanic eruption in the sense we understand today. The closest the Romans had was the word for fire. What was about to happen was beyond anything they had a framework to imagine.
On the morning of August 24th, 79 AD, though some modern scholars now argue the date may actually have been October based on food remains and seasonal clothing found at the site, Vesuvius exploded. The eruption began not with a river of lava, as many people imagine, but with a column of superheated gas, rock, and ash that shot upward into the sky with the force of something almost incomprehensible. Modern volcanologists estimate that the eruption released thermal energy equivalent to roughly 100,000 times the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The column of material rose an estimated 20 to 21 miles into the atmosphere, so high it would have been visible from Rome itself, more than 150 miles away. A young Roman naval commander named Pliny the Elder, stationed across the bay, reportedly compared the shape of the eruption column to a pine tree, a thick trunk rising and then spreading into a wide branching canopy of smoke and debris. We know this because his nephew, Pliny the Younger, was 17 years old that day and watching from across the bay. He survived. He wrote everything down, and his letters, addressed to the historian Tacitus, remain the only eyewitness account of the eruption that has ever been discovered. In the city itself, the first phase of the eruption was terrifying but survivable. Pumice stone, lightweight, porous volcanic rock, began raining down from the sky. It fell like a slow, relentless hail, accumulating on rooftops and in streets. People held pillows and cushions over their heads for protection. Some fled immediately, streaming out through the city gates in whatever direction seemed safe. Others chose to wait. The pumice was alarming, yes, but it was not immediately lethal. Many people may have believed that if they stayed inside, barricaded their doors, waited for the storm to pass, they would survive. They were wrong. What came next was something the modern world only began to fully understand in the 20th century. In the early morning hours of August 25th, the eruption column collapsed. When a volcanic column of that scale loses structural integrity, it does not simply fall straight down. It generates what scientists call a pyroclastic surge, a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic matter that races outward from the mountain at speeds of up to 180 miles per hour, at temperatures exceeding 480 degrees Fahrenheit. It moves faster than a human can run. It moves faster than a horse can gallop. It is, in every meaningful sense, unsurvivable. There were 6 of these surges in total. The first few struck Herculaneum, the smaller city to the northwest, essentially instantaneously. The city of Pompeii, slightly farther away, was reached by the 4th surge. By this point, the streets were already buried under several feet of pumice. The air was thick with ash, and then the surge arrived, and in moments that the geological record suggests lasted only seconds, it was over. Every person still in the city died. Not from lava, not from a slow suffocation, they died from the heat. Forensic analysis of skeletal remains at the site, particularly groundbreaking research conducted in the 2010s, showed evidence consistent with extreme thermal shock, temperatures high enough to cause near instantaneous death. The human body, caught in a surge like that, does not burn, it simply stops. And then the ash settled, and the city of Pompeii disappeared from the world. Over the following centuries, something remarkable happened, or rather, something remarkable failed to happen. Pompeii was not forgotten all at once. Roman writers referenced it. There were efforts in the years after the eruption to excavate and recover valuables from the buried region, but the ash layer was thick, in some places 12 feet or more, and the work was difficult, and eventually it stopped. The Roman Empire itself began its long decline. Languages changed. Maps were redrawn. The very name Pompeii faded from use, replaced by a Latin word meaning under, la civita, the locals eventually called the land above it. People walked over the ruins for 1,000 years without knowing they were there. A city that had once been home to 20,000 souls became simply a field.
Then, in 1599, an Italian architect named Domenico Fontana was directing a project to dig a new water channel through the region. As his workers cut through the earth, they began finding things: walls, painted frescoes, inscriptions in Latin. Fontana noted the discoveries in his records, but the work continued, and the channel was completed, and the finds were largely ignored. The world was not ready yet. The real rediscovery came in 1748. A Spanish military engineer named Roque Joaquín de Alcubierre was working under the patronage of the King of Naples when his excavations at a nearby estate began turning up objects of obvious ancient Roman origin. The digging expanded, more walls emerged, more paintings, more artifacts, and then, unmistakably, the outline of an entire city. Pompeii had been found.
What followed was, by the standards of the time, a dramatic and chaotic excavation. The early decades were not guided by any systematic archaeological method. Valuable objects were removed without documentation, contexts were destroyed, and treasures were carried off to private collections and royal palaces across Europe. But what the site revealed, even under those imperfect conditions, was staggering. Here was a Roman city frozen in time, not reconstructed, not interpreted through centuries of modification. Frozen exactly as it had been, at a single moment, in a single day, nearly 1,700 years in the past. The bread was still in the ovens, the graffiti was still on the walls, everything from election slogans to declarations of love to deeply human complaints about neighbors and landlords. A dog caught on a chain had left an impression in the hardened ash. A man had died with his hands over his face. The ghostly human shapes that have become the iconic image of Pompeii were not discovered in the initial excavations. It was not until 1863 that an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli, who had brought a new systematic rigor to the excavations, realized something extraordinary. Over the centuries, the bodies of those who died had decomposed within the hardened volcanic ash, leaving behind hollow cavities in the exact shape of the human form at the moment of death. Fiorelli developed a technique of pouring liquid plaster into these voids and allowing it to harden. When the surrounding ash was carefully removed, what emerged were plaster casts of the dead, men, women, children, a dog, in postures of their final moments. A woman with her hands pressed to her face, a man curled on his side, two people who appeared to be holding each other. The casts were not sculptures, they were not artistic interpretations, they were the direct physical impression of real human beings, preserved with a specificity that no portrait or painting could match. The ancient world had, in a very real sense, reached through the centuries and made itself impossible to look away from. The excavations at Pompeii have continued in one form or another ever since. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the work was driven by a hunger for dramatic finds, the spectacular, the valuable, the photogenic. But by the mid-20th century, the field of archaeology had transformed, and with it, the approach to Pompeii. Researchers began to understand that the site's greatest value lay not in its treasures, but in its totality, the position of ordinary objects, the distribution of different foods across different neighborhoods, the wear patterns on cobblestones that showed where cart traffic was heaviest, the height of stepping stones at crosswalks that revealed how deep the streets flooded in heavy rain. Pompeii was not just a ruin, it was a three-dimensional record of daily Roman life at a level of detail that exists nowhere else on Earth.
In the 21st century, that understanding deepened further. A major new project called the Great Pompeii Project, launched in 2012 with substantial European Union funding, combined traditional excavation with digital imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and chemical analysis of organic remains to map and analyze areas of the site that had never been properly studied. The results continued to generate new discoveries. In 2019, archaeologists uncovered a remarkably well-preserved ceremonial room in a suburban villa, its frescoes still vivid after 2 millennia. In 2020, the intact skeletal remains of 2 men, one older, one younger, were found in a position suggesting they had been caught mid-flight, trying to escape, and were overtaken by the surge. In 2021, a nearly complete Roman chariot, decorated with bronze and iron and still attached to its wooden frame, emerged from a stable on the outskirts of the city. Every season brings something new. An estimated 1/3 of the ancient city remains unexcavated. There is something quietly profound about the way Pompeii sits in the human imagination.
It is not the largest archaeological site in the world. It is not the oldest. In pure political terms, it was not even among the most important cities in the Roman Empire. But it holds a grip on us that these other metrics failed to explain. Part of it is the immediacy, the sense that you could walk those streets today and feel, more than in almost any other place on Earth, the presence of people who lived and breathed 2,000 years ago. You can see their handwriting. You can see what they ate for lunch. You can see the ruts left by the wheels of their carts, worn so deep into the stone that they look as though they were made last week. But there is something else, too, something harder to name. Pompeii is a reminder of how suddenly and completely the world can change. Those 20,000 people went to sleep on the night of August 23, 79 AD, in a city they had no reason to believe would not be there in the morning. They had plans, debts, dinners to make, conversations they had been meaning to have. The baker who left bread in his oven was expecting to sell it. The man who left an unfinished repair on his wall was expecting to finish it. None of them knew they were living in the last hours of their world. And yet, because of the very catastrophe that ended their lives, their world has lasted longer than almost anything else from antiquity. The eruption that destroyed Pompeii also preserved it. The same force that killed 20,000 people kept their city safe from the slow erosion of time, from the fires of conquest, from the recycling of stone that ended so many ancient buildings. Vesuvius, in its terrible indifference, created something extraordinary, a monument to ordinary life. That tension between destruction and preservation, between tragedy and legacy, is what makes Pompeii not just a historical site, but a mirror. When you look at the plaster cast of a man who died alone in a dark room, surrounded by rising ash, arms crossed over his chest, you are not looking at ancient Rome. You are looking at something that does not belong to any particular century. You are looking at a human being. And that, perhaps, is why we keep looking.